It is my great honor to introduce our speaker, Lennard Davis, who is professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago. As my students in the audience know, Professor Davis has been a central driving force in the development of disability studies almost since the very beginning. His book, Enforcing Normalcy, was a groundbreaking contribution to the field, demonstrating clearly how disability is not an exceptional state, nor a fringe civil rights concern, but a central and definitive component of the human experience. He has since edited 5 editions of the Disability Studies Reader, the most important anthology in the field, and his work spans the disciplines. I have used his articles to teach about disability in literature, the law, art history, and to discuss bridging the sciences with the humanities. He is a testament to the interdisciplinary potential of disability studies. In addition to being an English professor, he is also professor of disability and human development in the School of Applied Health Sciences, a professor of medical education in the College of Medicine, and the director of Project Biocultures, a think tank devoted to issues around the intersection of culture, medicine, disability, biotechnology, and the biosphere. His talk tonight, Disability Studies Across the Disciplines, Theory and Praxis, covers the broad usefulness of disability studies in the realms of the biocultural, biopolitical, intersectional, and governmental. From the classroom to the streets, disability studies and activism give us a model of how intellectual and political labor can work productively together. Please join me in welcoming Lennard Davis.
Thanks for coming. I am bilaterally mic'd here, so I'm having a slight auditory hallucination speaking. But I want to thank Marianne, thank the Humanities, the Health Humanities Lab, Denise, Kat, and everybody else that she thanked by extension through her. And I also thank Marianne also for that nice presentation, which actually kind of covers my whole talk, so maybe I should just go home. Anyway, I have an interesting assignment for tonight. Oh, I'm actually going to also speak for 40 minutes, and I'm setting my timer to make sure that I don't have academic disease here of speaking too much too long. So the task for today is to present to you a lot of different things about disability studies. And in a way, it's going to be very general, and in a way, it's going to be weirdly focused and specific at moments. So, it's a complicated task, and I'm just trying to figure it out. So the first thing is, I just knocked this up the other day, list of fields, and you can probably add to them, that are implicated in disability studies. And the point being that disability studies is a broad field that can link itself to a number of different disciplines. And there's plenty of, if you go to the library and look, there's a lot of work in any of those particular fields relating to disability. I think it's also important to say that people may be working on disability-related things without thinking of themselves as being in disability studies. And I think one of the things about a conference like this is to bring together people who are working in medicine, science, technology, philosophy, and so on, but maybe working on things that they don't call disability studies. There's also, just in terms of theoreticians or philosophers who are involved in disability studies, and they are involved in other fields as well. Somebody like Michel Foucault, whose work on power, discourse, and normativity fits really nicely into disability studies. Marcel Mauss, whose work on body techniques and habitus also have been used. And you can go down the line. Judith Butler, Lacan, Marx, Sigmund Freud, pretty much everything. Deleuze and Guattari, ideas about assemblages, Bourdieu, habitus, and Edward Said, constructing the other. All of those works and more, philosophers and more, can easily fit into the rubric of disability studies, along with those philosophers in disability studies who do the work of disability. In terms of literature, I just made up a kind of very limited collection of images, but the literature is filled with people with disabilities or characters with disabilities. Part of the work of disability studies is to understand how they're used, how they're deployed, what functions they serve. Tiny Tim on the upper left, Captain Ahab on the upper right, who's both physically has a disability and also has affective disabilities, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Glass Menagerie. The lower left picture is from a film version of Sound and Fury. That's Benji, Horse, Richard III. And there's a movie called Safe, which some of you may have seen, about a woman with environmental allergies. So obviously literature, obviously art. I just have a very limited selection. I have a slideshow with like hundreds of pictures, but this is a picture. These are pictures on the upper left of Christ healing a blind person. Also on the upper right, Christ healing a blind person from the Sienese school. The left is El Greco. Just some images on lower right is Bruegel's picture of beggar. It's called Beggars, and that actually opens up a whole other field about the relationship between poverty and disability. So the middle picture on the bottom is by Callot, and it's also beggar who has has a series of etchings of beggars who are also disabled, and then there's just a deaf person or hearing impaired person from the 18th century. So art, obviously, as literature, is rife for the study of disability and how it's deployed. Interestingly, music too. On the left is Paul Wittgenstein, who was a friend of Ravel and who had lost one arm. He had his left hand. So Ravel and a bunch of people like Berlioz, friends of his, wrote piano pieces for the left hand for him. But they are also widely played, and it's hard to play with the left hand, so it's also an interesting challenge for anyone. Evelyn Glennie in the middle is a deaf drummer who is considered by many the best drummer in the world. And you all know the guy on the lower left who is reputed to have been deaf. The right is a rock band that made up of deaf musicians, and on the upper right was a deaf version, a combined deaf and hearing version of Spring Awakening that was done by Deaf West in New York and various other places. It's a musical with song signing. So you can imagine, something you would assume that deafness would have nothing to do with music, but if all you have to do is look into it carefully, and there's a whole huge connection between various disabilities and music. The other thing is, and it's true for a lot of other studies, but it particularly works well in disability studies, which is that there's an intimate connection between theory and praxis. So activism and disability activists have been almost the spur of what brought disability studies into being. And on the upper left is a kind of important moment called the Capitol Crawl. It's come to be called the Capitol Crawl, in which people with disabilities climbed up the steps of the Capitol through their wheelchairs away in their assistive devices and crawled up very painstakingly, in the case of many people, to try to get the ADA passed. On the right is a group called ADAPT, which were still around, and their main interest is transportation accessibility. They tended to be and to look like kind of Hell's Angels and do a lot of blocking of buses and chaining themselves together. They have a kind of rep, in activist circles. Also on the lower left is a protest against $1 Million Baby. There's been a lot of activism around films because films tend to have a very similar narrative, which is either the kill or cure narrative. So either films are about people with disabilities who get cured, or people with disabilities who kill themselves or ask other people to kill them. So there's been a lot of activism around various films, and I'm sure you know all the films involved, or many of them. And I'll come to that later too. And then, so I think it's important because when unlike many conferences, academic conferences, when you go to conferences like the Society for Disability Studies, the people who are there are activists as well as academics, and then there is the interesting interchange between the academic and the uncomfortable and comfortable at moments for both sides. So then there's the political. I just put this up because I have a book which I wrote about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I think it's important to note that in 1990, when the law was passed, it's the largest civil rights bill ever passed anywhere, and it's the model for civil rights disability legislation around the world. It was really accomplished by a combination of academics kind of theorizing, lawyers figuring it out, activists coming together, and it wouldn't have happened had it not been for that confluence. And by the way, and I interviewed over 50 people to write the book, people who were involved, and everybody, including Steny Hoyer and people who are around now, Bob Dole, said it could never be passed now. This bill would never be passed now. So it's time, place, and talent. I want to just kind of present some of for those, many of you know this, but for those of you who don't, I want to present a kind of very quick approach to discussing the idea behind the founding of a certain kind of disability studies. And so it postulates that there are three models, and you can see them historically. So it's a kind of diachronic explanation. And the first model would be the charity model, which begins with the idea of God and sin, and people are disabled because either they're being punished by God, or it's God's mysterious ways, or they've committed a sin. So, or they've committed a sin. So they get their disability, or because of their parents' actions, and then the cure, if you want to, or the answer to the problem is either prayer on the one hand, or alms, giving alms to the disabled. So then that's succeeded by the medical model, let's say in the 19th century. And in the medical model, you're disabled not because of God or sin, but because of genetics, because of disease or trauma. You get the disability, and the remedy is treatment or care. So and those two models were sort of like pre-existing disability studies. And disability studies, particularly in the UK, came up with the social model. And the social model, and a lot of the people in the UK were Marxists, so it has a kind of Marxist flavor to it. And that model basically says that it's not genetics, trauma, God, sin, but it's the political, social, and cultural practices in a society that create disability. They may also make a distinction between disability and impairment. And so the distinction is that an impairment is a physical or mental limitation, lack, inability, and so on. But the disability is the effect of discrimination or lack of accommodation against people with impairments. So in that model, I assume that now and again, Through a Glass Darkly, we'll do this. So that is, that would be like sort of like the foundational model for understanding disability. There's also something that's come in since disability studies, particularly in the UK, called critical disability studies. And it really corresponds, critical disability studies corresponds with also, I would say, the kind of disability studies we do in the US, which is essentially humanities-based, theory-driven, and so on. And so there was a kind of fight in disability studies between, in a way, the Marxist foundational model and then critical disability studies or disability studies in the humanities using some of the theoreticians that I was talking about. But I think by this point that distinction has evened out, and everybody more or less is doing critical disability studies. So okay, those are sort of like the general things. Then I wanted to talk about a little bit about my work in enforcing normalcy. And what I did in that book was to, and for me this is foundational for my sense of how I entered disability studies, which was that it came from a sort of strange little moment where I began to ask myself the question, like, when did people start talking about being normal? Because if you think about disability is sort of postulated against being normal. So disability, we say, would be abnormal. And it turns out that this weird confluence happened where the word starts very late. It doesn't enter the OED until mid-19th century. It does it in French and a couple of other languages around the same time. So it didn't exist before. Earlier it just referred to either a certain type of teaching school or a carpenter's, what do you call that, square, which was called a normal square. But, and this is Adolphe Quetelet, and he was the first person who essentially decided to, the other thing was that the word normal tended to be, that the people who tended to use it were two groups which were essentially the same group, and they were statisticians who then all ended up being eugenicists. So the word normal comes from statistics, and obviously the normal curve is the bell curve or the normal curve is a way of talking about how you think about variation and normalcy within that. Adolphe Quetelet was the first person who essentially said, let's use statistics, which literally means statistics. Statistics are data about the state, how many people live in the state, populations, numbers of building, income, so and so. And he said, why can't we do that with human bodies? So Quetelet actually started measuring human bodies to find out what was the average, what he called l'homme moyen, the average man, and what the average arm length was, leg, so on. And so he was sort of, in a way, the first person to really lay out this issue about statistics applied to the body and an idea of the normal. And then the person who's sort of well known for this is Sir Francis Galton. He was Darwin's cousin, first cousin, and he was the founder of eugenics. I can't get into all of that. You know something about eugenics, but it was, eugenics was the idea that you could breed better human beings. And, it was a very progressive idea. I mean, people really retrospectively look at eugenics and say, like, how could anybody do that? But the reality is that eugenics actually was, it was the equivalent of, in the 19th century, to breeding animals. Most of, like, all of our dogs, all the dog breeds that we have were basically bred in the 19th century. And so the idea was, if you could breed dogs and cows and make them better, why not breed humans? So Galton suggested that, but in a positive way, like not killing people and not sterilizing them, but trying to get the best people to marry each other. So it's a very Darwinian, he was working with his cousin, very Darwinian idea. But just to go to the idea of normal, Galton used the normal curve as a tool, but interestingly, he had a problem, because if you are thinking of the normal curve and you're thinking about human traits like intelligence or size or strength, what you're going to find out is that the majority of people are in the middle. And if you're trying, if you think of intelligence, on the one hand, you might have people who are not intelligent. On the other side, you have people who are very intelligent. And the middle is mediocrity. So that was a problem for him as a eugenicist. So what he did was flip the normal curve around and create what he called an ogive, which was a way of then saying the preferred trait would be on the right, and therefore that would be intelligence, strength, and so on, and the left would be the less desirable traits. So that really sort of the foundation of the thinking of what's normal and abnormal in the UK, US, and spread around the world. And what that in fact did was it was applied to racial groups, and this is photographs of what would be the fitter family and the unfit family. And the word fitness, which is still with us today, comes from this eugenic issue that comes out of the idea of normality. So for me, normality is kind of very central to how we think about disability and how certain people get described as normal and other people not. I'm also interested, in a lot of earlier work in disability studies was about physical disabilities, but mental disabilities are very important, and I wrote a book about OCD, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to make the analogy between psychological things and physical things. So the wheelchair analogy, what I'm calling the wheelchair analogy, is when a person is a person using a wheelchair is not disabled until they meet a pair of steps, until they meet steps, and there's no ramps and no elevators. So this is an argument about the environment creating the disability. But with a psychiatric disorder, what is the equivalent of the steps? In other words, what are the barriers? And how, and the other so the solution to the wheelchair problem is to provide ramps and elevators. But what's the solution to the psychiatric problem? And I think that there are lots of discussions about that now. And I have a student who's just doing her dissertation on MAD studies, as it's called, which is a kind of interesting development. It's tied in with the whole issue of neurodiversity, and trying to redefine what's madness. And as with all of these things, what's important is to have the people who are asking the questions be the people with the disabilities, because for too long we've had the issue of people with disabilities being studied by, being spoken for by people without disabilities. So there's, if you're interested, there's a very good website called mindfreedom.org, which is basically run by people with affective disorders, and this group calls itself survivors or consumers, either survivors of the mental health system or consumers, and postulates its own relationship to the resources that many people need. There's also another group called Hearing Voices, by people who hear voices, and their attitude is, they're a worldwide organization, and their attitude is like, yeah, we hear voices, it's a neurological glitch in our brains, we're not crazy, we need to figure out how to go through the day with this kind, with hearing voices. So in terms of the whole issue of disability and impairment, the social model says that there's this thing called impairment, and that's kind of medically diagnosed, and then there's this thing called disability, and that in some ways is created by the environment. But it becomes a little harder to talk about that in certain kinds of ways. So physical impairments, one would say, are real, I would use that in scare quotes, based on medical diagnoses. But psychiatric impairments are real, if you would put those in scare quotes, based on psychiatric diagnoses. But are psychiatric diagnoses real, or are they socially constructed, or both? And so that raises the question of impairment, because impairment used to feel like a rock-solid concept. But now I think one of the aspects of critical disability studies is to question even the absolute solidity of impairment. And in terms of psychiatric disorders, my book, Obsession, A History, really asks, what is OCD? And it says, and in a lot of ways it says it's a functional brain disorder. Some people say that. It's a genetic disorder is another approach. It's a neurochemical disorder. It's an anxiety disorder. It's a personality disorder. In other words, there's so many different definitions floating around about something like OCD, or could you say it was a socially constructed disorder? And when I say socially constructed, I don't mean that it isn't true and it doesn't exist and that people don't suffer from it, but I'm just saying that there is, within medicine, and this is kind of one of my sort of biocultural points, is that different societies have a symptom pool, you could say, like a pool of symptoms that we can reach into and pull out at any given historical moment. And then the question is, how are those symptom pools assembled? What do we call those things? And that itself is, very much human related. It's constructed. There are the DSM, which is the Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, is made up of committees of people who make decisions about what will be in it and what won't be in it, and those things assemble symptoms into knowable, nameable things. So one of the questions that I raise is first of all, does it matter if a disease has a history? And if we look at the history of the disease, we come up with certain kinds of things. One is that the models vary according to nation and culture. So there are certain things there are certain diseases that don't exist in the US that are well accepted in other countries. I mean, the analogy, I spent a lot of time in Italy, and the analogy I always use is in Italy or France, people have livers and they talk about them. You'll say to someone, how are you feeling today? And they go, oh, my liver. And in the United States, no one talks about their liver. So, I mean, they're not wrong to do it. They just have a way of talking about the way they feel based on growing up in a culture where their parents said, I think your liver is a little off today. So that these models vary according to nation and culture. The DSM, which it says in its opening, exists to enforce consensus where there may not be consensus between sub-specializations. The disease model is seen as an analogy, so disease models are analogic, I guess you'd say. Psychiatric diagnoses are synchronic. So what I mean by that is that in any given moment, there is a general agreement on a specific number of diseases. What happens if you look at it diachronically over time is that those definitions change. So the point is that for medicine, often the past is just a history of error. Everything in the past is wrong, and what's happening right now is right. And of course there's a kind of utopian thing like at this moment, everything is correct. But we know in 20 or 30 years that we'll look back on this moment diachronically and we'll say like, well, we didn't quite believe that anymore. So that's one of the issues. And culture and history are always excluded from a diagnostic category. Not always, but usually. So that is to say that all previous diagnostic models are wrong by definition. Then I wanted to just bring up a few other issues which might be sort of thought of as, just checking my time, might be thought of as like tension points within disability studies. And one is the issue of pain. So, especially in the US, disability had a more positive sense. The idea was there was a whole disability movement, disability pride. We should say that disability is great, as people did with, African American pride and various Latinx pride. And every oppressed group has a stage where it needs to say like we're better than people are saying we are. We value who we are. But pain makes it complicated because people who are in pain, it's hard to celebrate pain, You can't say like, this is a great thing, I'm happy I'm in pain. So it just raises the issue about the over-valorization of a certain kind of identity. And then dealing with, in this sort of second wave disability studies, what do you do about pain? What do you do about parts of disability that are hard, that are uncomfortable, that don't fit into a celebratory mode? So that's one thing. The other thing haven't talked about deafness at all, but deafness has a complicated relationship with disability. And the deaf community for a long time saw itself as not disabled and didn't see itself as in the disability studies orbit, because deaf people feel like, hey, we're not disabled, we just have a different language. And we're a cultural minority. We have a history, we have a language, we have a culture, and the only problem is that most of you don't speak sign language. So thereby, and if you were bilingual, that is, if you signed and understood sign language, then there wouldn't be a problem. So on the other hand, 95% of deaf people are born to hearing parents. So it's not a group that can follow itself along over the generations, and that it's almost like every generation has to rediscover deafness. So now we have a technological fix, and I haven't talked about technology, but technology is intimately related to disability and to deafness. And the technological fix is cochlear implants. The standard scenario is that a parent gives birth to a child who is very early. Now we can detect very early if someone's deaf. There's the usual bewailing of the fact that the child can't hear, and then very early on, within a week or two, they're visited by an audiologist who says, "Don't worry, we can cure this. We have cochlear implants. The child can have," and now bilateral cochlear implants are more the rule than the exception, as early as like 6 months or even younger. So the hearing parents go like, "Fine, do it." Obviously, the child has no say, and but the matter, the truth of the matter is that it's not a cure. In some ways, cochlear implants are getting better, but they're like really good hearing aids, but they're not a cure, and anyone who wears them will take off the processor and be deaf, at least 12 hours a day. But the other thing is that we don't understand, and I'm going to try to show you this, that what things sound like, because I think in our ear we have something like thousands and thousands of cilia. Each one of them receive and interpret sound. Cochlear implants, I think the best ones have about 30 or 40 of those receptors. And when you insert a cochlear implant, by the way, you get rid of any residual hearing that the child might have in order to do that. Plus, they're also stuck with that technology for the rest of their life. You can't take it out and put a new one in. The processors can change, but not the technology. So, so like here's a piece of music you might be familiar with, by Beethoven. Okay. And this is what this is what it sounds like. Sorry, Monty Python. That's coming up. This is what it sounds like with a cochlear implant. Just so that you understand that this is not the same thing. And in terms of sound, I have a little Monty Python.
The BBC would like to announce that the next scene is not considered suitable for family viewing. It contains scenes of violence involving people's heads and arms getting chopped up.
This is what that sounds like. All right, I think you get the point. So, so there is there could be a lively discussion about cochlear implants and whether they should be used or not. I just add like one detail about that, which is that I'm not against cochlear implants. I mean, their technology can be useful. It's not useful for everybody. Some children do better than others with them. But the point about it is that because there's 3 companies in the world that make cochlear implants, and by the way, very profitable. If you want to have a bilateral cochlear implant, it's about the price of a down payment on a multi-million-dollar home. If you want to just have one, it's about the price of a really nice Mercedes with everything on it. And everyone makes money along the way, so there is a financial incentive. But the thing about the cochlear implant is that some kids do well, some don't. They've made a rule, at least in the United States and many other countries, that if you implant a child, you cannot let the child learn sign language. And because if you do, the information that's coming into a child's eyes at 1 or 2 or 6 months old is working. It's very powerful, relevant information. What's coming into the ears sounds kind of like that. So the child will tend to focus on the sign language and not pay attention. So then the argument is that they're not developing neural networks, and that therefore you need to isolate. So that's a real problem because, yeah, you can see where that's going. All right, I have a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to move on. Another issue that's current is this issue about genetic testing and prenatal screening. You've all probably seen Gattaca. You know the scenario about being able to choose. The Gattaca scenario is becoming more and more real. And particularly for people who are using pre-implantation technology, there comes these decisions that need to be made. You may have to choose among a series of fertilized eggs or zygotes, one of which may have a disability or the potential for a disability, and the others not. You will be counseled, and the point will be: will you choose the child who's going to be deaf, or will you choose the child who, or at least the zygote with the potential to not have that trait? With amniocentesis, that's obviously an area. It's interesting because we usually say that eugenics is over now. It's a done deal. But what's interesting is that the center for eugenics, it was in Cold Springs Harbor, and I always say, like, eugenics was doing very well. A lot of progressive people thought eugenics was good until the Nazis gave it a bad name. So after World War II, the Center for Eugenics in Cold Spring Harbor changed its name and changed it to the Center for Genetics. It's the same place. And so in some ways, eugenics lives now in this area of genetic testing and prenatal screening. There's also a kind of controversy about assisted suicide. You may remember Brittany Maynard, who was kind of a poster child for assisted suicide. There are a couple of movies like The Barbarian Invasions and The Sea Inside. And the issue is, there are more and more states now that are approving assisted suicide. The question is this a process that would somehow tilt toward discriminating against people with disabilities? And would there be pressure on people with disabilities to kill themselves? Will family and friends push toward that? Will hospitals with limited beds suggest that? I think it's an open and lively discussion. And I have my opinions, but we can discuss that later. Another issue is this issue around facilitated sex or sexual surrogacy. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Sessions. I recommend it. It's a good movie. And unlike many other films about disability, the director is a person with a disability, and the writer of the actual piece it was based on was a person who was actually very much like the person who's depicted. And so the question is whether if people who have severe disabilities and do not have the opportunity necessarily to have sex, should there be sexual surrogacy? Should there be sexual therapists who work with them? That's being debated all over the place and all over the world, and there's some really interesting literature on it. Obviously, the reasons for, I think you can understand what the reasons for, but there are certainly reasons against. And this is a quote from this book, Being Bought. And this is a statement opposing surrogacy because it is a form of, can be a form of prostitution. So that is up in the air. The other issue, I think, interestingly, is should disabled actors play disabled roles? And by and large, when we see movies that are about disability, the vast majority of them have non-disabled actors playing the roles. And many of them win Academy Awards because it's kind of like a great way to win an Academy Award if you are a non-disabled person playing a disabled role. And that, for example, the character in Glee who's the wheelchair user is not a wheelchair user. And when they do dancing on the show, when they did dancing on the show, they had to use a body double for him. So, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So the picture, I have a picture on the right of Al Jolson in blackface because people compare actors who are non-disabled playing disabled roles to people who are not black playing black people, and instead of calling it blacking up, people call it cripping up, the process of doing that. There are many actors who are disabled nowadays, and more so, who are playing disabled roles, and that is something that we need to see a whole lot more of. In addition to simply seeing it for cultural reasons, we also need to see it for practical reasons, because if you're a disabled person and you want to be an actor, there's kind of a big sign up that says forget about it. That's something that we need to have people, a disabled kid saying to his parent, I'd like to be an actor, and them saying, yeah, go for it. There's a real chance for you. It's hard to be an actor anyway, but. So we casually mentioned the idea of the biocultural, and I just want to check my time here. Okay, I'm going to skip that. And what I wanted to talk about just very briefly is whenever I go to a place, I always look up the website to see how well that place is dealing with disability, at least on its website. So the thing that was interesting about Duke, I usually look and see the diversity things, and there's always a nice display of diversity in the university, but without any people with disabilities. But Duke actually doesn't have a lot of pictures of people. Duke has a lot of pictures of buildings. So I don't know whether they're celebrating buildings or what. You should check it out. It's an interesting process. But the one thing that there is a disability kind of resource center. There's no disability studies, and I think that's the point. There's no disability culture that's listed on the website particularly. But there is this kind of very legalistic stuff. And I found what was fascinating was that if you look at this disability status definitions, it's wrong. It is the definitions according to the 1990 ADA, but not to the revision, the Amendments Act in 2008, which totally got rid of these definitions because they ended up being bollocksed up in court. This thing about one or more life activities. So I think someone should tell people here. But I also there was one little outsourcing on the disability page to something called Alexander Street, which I hadn't heard of, which has nothing to do with Duke. And it's kind of like, if you're interested in anything about disability studies, check this out. It's not here. All right, so I know this has been kind of a rapid Cook's tour of certain corners of disability studies. But if they're in the Q&A, I'm willing to talk about anything in greater depth. So.
My name is Rasul Smith, and I live with disabled children. My daughter to my left has been disabled legally for the last 5 years with neuromyelitis. My question to you is concerning the act that you just said that Duke their website does not come up with being disabled with the definition correctly. How will we as the people go to them and have them to correct that? Because from experience, I know that even the medical staff is not quite up to par. So how will we go about fixing that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think universities have become a little sensitive, not much, but a little, to issues around identity. There's been a steep learning curve. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but one of the biggest institutions that were against the ADA were the universities. They had lobbyists come to Washington. They did not want to have the ADA applied to universities for lots of reasons. So yeah, but I think that if someone in this room were to just make a phone call to who? You guys would know who to call. And just say like, hey, you need to get that definition up to shape. I think they might be embarrassed. So I think embarrassment is a good tactic.
The Chronicle.
The Chronicle is good. I was about to say, or if you go to the local newspaper and say, hey, I got an interesting story for you. Yeah.
Hey, listen, the other approach is also, I had some issues, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Hillary, and I am legally blind, and I had trouble with the website. I had a lot of trouble with Duke, but they do respond. You just have to call. So maybe the webmaster, find out who's in charge of the website. But if you don't speak out, you don't get results. And Duke Performances, it's an education process. I spend a lot of time being angry, but being disabled, as an advocate, you spend a lot of time, to make change, you have to advocate.
Right.
Instead of being angry and nasty, you can take that approach, but it doesn't always work.
Well, what's interesting is that, in terms of the ADA, the biggest number of lawsuits that are coming out of it right now are from the National Association of the Blind about websites. For corporate websites, university websites, access to educational materials in universities when they're like online, also by the deaf people. But the issue around accessibility of websites is a dramatic area.
Thanks for all of your comments. And I guess, though, the comment you just made a couple minutes ago is the one that really arrested me, that universities were one of the main forces opposing the ADA. And I'd like to hear more about that. I have to say a little bit, I'm wondering, is it really just about Gothic universities and bad architecture? Or is it really kind of going to the core of the kind of people who identify with universities, the meritocracy, people who identify with high abilities and high achievement and all these kind of things? Do you think could that be part of the not getting it?
Yeah, no, I think, definitely Gothic, as you call them, or older universities where they have to retrofit everything. But even new ones, There's a famous story about Ed Roberts, who was one of the activists at Berkeley, early activists at Berkeley. And there's a photograph, which you can find online. The university didn't want to let him in because he basically had to get around in a bed. And there's this image of them pulling this bed up into a dorm room. Yeah, they're just, I think there's an administrative headset. If those of us who are faculty know we've bumped into that, it's kind of like, how are we going to do that? It's going to cost so much money. We'll never be able, it's never been done. But the two big institutions that were against the ADA, well, three. One was business for similar reasons. The other was, the Greyhound buses. Buses that, not urban buses, but particularly, what do they call them? Over the road, I think they're called buses. That was a huge element. Also religious groups, churches. All the people you think would be for it, there's a carve-out in the ADA that says that it doesn't apply to churches and synagogues and mosques. The ADA does not apply to them. They won that one.
Why is that?
Because they got lobbyists in there, and they also said church and state, and you can't tell us what to do. If you're interested, it's a fascinating history. I wrote this book called Enabling Acts about the ADA, and I didn't know anything about the ADA, frankly, until I wrote the book. And I discovered, and it's all in there, the machinations. I tried to write it as kind of like a Washington whodunit kind of thriller. So you get to see these people come in and lobby against it, and how it weirdly, I said it was a serendipitous thing that the ADA got passed, and it was serendipitous, and some of it revolved around completely whimsical things like a Thursday night poker game, which got basically a bunch of hippies from Berkeley into the White House. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. History is a strange creature.
So we have time for two more questions. So I have one here and then you in the back. So I'll come around to you after this question.
First of all, thank you for a really excellent discussion and talk. That was great. I guess let me preface the question with just a short, really short story. So some of you have already told it to. So when the LGBTQ Center here was opened a few years ago, President Broadhead, the university president at the time, was the speaker at the opening ribbon-cutting moment, and he said, this is great. Two of the most illustrious faculty members in our history were a black man, John Hope Franklin, and a gay man, Reynolds Price. What he left out of that was that also Reynolds Price used a wheelchair. So he could have included, and a person with a disability in that conversation about what essentially he was talking about, which was diversity. So that is prefaced to the question of suggestions for how to be sure that diversity is included and that disability is included in all of our discussions when every group in our society these days is talking about diversity.
Yeah.
We leave it out.
Yeah. I knew Reynolds Price, by the way. That is a huge question, and I'll try to just give a couple of suggestions. I wrote a piece for the Chronicle saying exactly that, like, why is disability left out of the diversity paradigm? And it is. I think it's really important that universities include disability in their diversity statements, official statements, and not just use the language, but include it in a daily basis. I think having, when you have events like this and you don't have closed captioning or sign language interpretation, you're basically hanging a sign outside the room saying no deaf people allowed. And then they say, well, no deaf people came, so then we shouldn't do it. So I think even I've been in the disability world for a long time, and I forget sometimes when there's an event to make sure that all of the things that Miriam said, and and that's expanding too. Just one example in the news today, I don't know if you saw, but James Byrd, one of his murderers from the dragging death in Texas, was just executed. Not for execution, but he was executed last night. And what everybody forgets about James Byrd was that he was a man with a disability. And I wrote about that at the time because the newspapers covered it for the first few days, and then it got forgotten by the fact that he was African American, which is important, super important. But the combination, the intersection, if you want, of disability and race makes people even more vulnerable, you know. And that is the point that we, you know, so intersectionality argues that we have to remember these things together. But I think that one of the weaknesses, if you want, of the intersectional argument is that it's great for minority groups that, or oppressed groups that have gotten recognition. But disability always kind of falls off out of view. And I think there are groups that are aiming for social justice for people with disabilities that are saying, you know, we go to these LGBTQ things, we go to this, but we don't feel included. You know, so that's just, it requires constant vigilance, which is not easy.
Hi, back here.
Oh, hi.
Hi, my name is Beshara, and I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for your comments. And I am a person who works at a university, a public institution in a 10-mile radius, I'll just leave it there, who has been working in the field for about 6 years. And I want to just say a couple of things. I appreciate all of your comments. I'm very much an advocate for disability studies. And I do want to say that, you know, in response to the lady's comment about the website, you know, when I first got trained, I went to another big public institution to get my training and, you know, just kind of get some best practices. And one of the first things we talked about was the definition of a disability, and like what you said about the ADA and ADA as amended in 2008. And so what I want to say is, you know, the way we're trained as persons working with students who are coming in our offices every day is that that's what the definition is, because, you know, we're making these legal decisions. But I will say, a phone call to that office, I actually know the folks in that office, and I know some others, like I said, in the 10-mile radius. A lot of institutions, I've been across the state speaking about different kinds of things we do as best practices. So anyway, I think that what we have to do is just go back to the table, because, you know, what we're using is what we've been taught. And, you know, but like you say, the community needs to speak. The community of persons with disabilities need to speak and let us know, you know, people like me who work in these offices, seeing students every day, writing accommodations letters, legal decisions we're making on behalf of the university every day to help students to have the support that they need. I was late because I was doing that. Today I wrote something, you know, just sent somebody's letters of accommodation off. But anyway, what I'm saying is I agree with everything you're saying, but we just need to hear from the community, you know, so that we can understand what we need to do to make it better, you know, for the community.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay, so that, excuse me, I'm sorry. That concludes this portion of our event. Let's have another round of applause for us.